Greetings, friends. It's so great to be with you. Thank you so much for going on this journey with us in A Wonderful Life, this worship series that helps us take an honest look, a compassionate look at our anxiety around money, perhaps, or everybody has different deals, and that's what we're kind of looking at. And I'm so excited today to have Mieke Vandersall with me. Mieke has a company called Vandersall Collective, and she has agreed to come and talk to us because she works with churches around these very issues. Mieke, welcome today.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Tell us just a little bit, the folks have kind of a bio or a snapshot in front of them, but just tell us a little bit about what you do with churches in guiding them through these discussions.
So I think that comes a little bit out of my own story. I worked with a religious nonprofit for many years, and out of that work began to realize that I enjoyed fundraising and was good at it, that there was an opportunity there to help people live their faith in action through their giving and through their commitment. And when I was done working with that nonprofit, I worked for a secular nonprofit, and we did fundraising work. And I learned so much during that time, but what wasn't happening in that time was an ability to pastorally walk people through conversations around money and how their communities had woven a story and how that integrated with their own individual stories as well. And so it came time for me to work with other trusted professionals that I knew and I had collected over the years, and for us to be able to then go out and work with congregations and nonprofits to think about who they are, what the call is that God is placing on their hearts, and then how to actually achieve that call, how to actually live into the thing that God wasn't letting go of with them.
Yeah.
And so we do, if you just break it down, basically strategic planning and fundraising and communications, but it's so much more than that, because we're able to really walk communities through journeys and processes around understanding who they are, who God is calling them to be, and then how to raise the funds that go along with that and communicate that to the wider world.
That's such a helpful process, and really that was my goal in bringing a series like this to the Worship Design Studio, and that is that we often just try to raise money without dealing with our own discomfort sometimes or anxiety around that. And so if we're all individually feeling sort of ambiguous or not completely comfortable about our own relationship with money, then we bring all of that into the community and that whole process. And
yes.
So to sort of go back and look at the spiritual foundations of our attitudes about money, our attitudes about living in this, as Maggie says in her book, the whale of the system, the money system we live in.
You never get away from it.
Right, we can't get away from it. It's part of what so how do we then take our spirituality, our faith journey, and let it inform or help us or guide us into this subject? So it sounds like the process you take folks through is very much anchored in this sense of spirituality, our own relationship to money, and then bringing a healthy sense of that to the whole.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Mieke has created this just little document, this little handout, and some of you may be watching this on your own in preparation for perhaps a finance team meeting, or perhaps you're watching it together before you encounter these questions and sort of work through these questions. And we want to thank you, Mieke, for sort of helping us in this beginning way to deal with some foundational questions. So we're just going to go through these and see what we can discover and sort of prep people to have their own conversations about these questions. The series, A Wonderful Life, the worship series, is using, as Maggie does in her book about money and meaning, the film It's a Wonderful Life, and looks really interestingly at the different characters and their attitudes to a money crisis, really, is what is at the core of that movie. And I love the beginning of the movie when God and Clarence, the angel, are talking, and God says, I got to send you down because there's this guy, George, and he needs our help. Clarence says, oh, is he sick? And God says, no, worse, he's discouraged.
Oh.
And so that is such a powerful exchange, I think, because sometimes it feels like discouragement around finances is like being sick, or not dealing with our finances is actually being sick in terms of how we deal with it. Why is this, Mieke? Why is it that churches need so much help like yours to have this conversation? Why are we so uneasy?
I think it's because we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And so when we don't talk about things, they build up, and narratives are spun, and we don't even know we're living into them. And so I don't know why, money falls in the category of things that are unspeakable, along with often sex and politics. And the thing that we're supposed to be doing as church is to be able to go into this territory that's scary, but that we have something else holding us up, being our faith, to be able to have these conversations.
Right.
So I think it's just the at least in the cultures of congregations that I work with, which granted, are often white and middle class, there is a lot of silence in money. And when we don't talk about it in our own families, and then we come together as a family of faith, we really don't have the skills to be able to move through that.
Yeah. So you invite us to begin with a question: what words would you use to describe the culture of money in your congregation or organization? So what are you helping us do here in this foundational question? What are we doing in beginning to, well, it sounds like speaking out loud is the first step, right? Like actually having the conversation.
Exactly. And coming at the conversation through a posture of noticing, I think, is really important. That we're not trying to judge. I'm not here to judge the words that come to your mind. I just want you to notice, when is it and how is it that you speak about money in your congregation or your organization? And from that noticing, just having that posture and taking a few weeks and writing down lists of when it comes up and how it comes up and how do you feel about it when that happens, and comparing notes with each other. Who knows what kind of conversations might be spurred from that that you couldn't have planted just by spending time noticing around your own community.
What are some examples of words that you've heard pop up in congregations?
So the words that so often pop up are silence, anxiety, not enough. We talk about it once a year in October, which is when everybody tries to not come to church. They're pretty negative conversations, pretty negative emotions and words that come up around this. And then thinking about when does it happen? When do we talk about money? It's often just only when we need something, or around that dreaded stewardship season that we're trying to transform in the work that you're doing, Marcia.
Right.
So that's often when it comes up, or then also just when there's a campaign. Okay, now we have to do a capital campaign, so we actually have to talk about this and figure this out, or we have to meet our budget and we have to figure this out. Really, often words of scarcity are forward. We don't have enough to do this. We don't have enough to do that. Rather than perhaps thinking about what we do have enough to be able to do.
Right. So only when we have to, and so what part of the message in the worship series, hopefully, is compassion. To come at it with compassion, and to say this stuff is hard. This is not an easy thing, especially because many churches are experiencing less of a budget than they may have had once before, and so there's also these feelings of self-worth and self-doubt and all of those things. So why would we want to talk about it? Let's just.
That we might have used to have had more power in society than we do now. That as things are changing, often for mainline churches, that there's an identity that goes behind this that's scaring us.
Right.
Is that shifting?
Right. And you go on to ask us about stories of money. And you mentioned already this word narrative. We sort of spin these narratives. We have these beliefs, and there may be stories that we repeat and repeat that make a difference to either our attitudes about money or our self-worth or how we see ourselves. Tell us a little bit more about telling stories.
Well, let me tell you two stories.
Okay.
I'll respond by telling a story.
Yeah.
As I've asked people to tell their stories, often the stories that come up are around the offering plate as children. And when we were kids, we were perhaps given some money to put in that offering plate, or we had to tithe on our own allowances. I never got an allowance, so that wasn't a thing for me. But I remember putting $1 in the offering plate that was my own money that I had earned. And no doubt my parents gave me money to put in when I was younger, when I couldn't earn. But a lot of people think about the learning that happens as you give, even as a young child, that it's important to do that. But also then what comes out of that is that money is something that the adults handle, that if money is given to you as a child to put into the offering plate, the money is still in the power of the adults, not in the power of the children. And so it's just an interesting thing to think about, kind of the lessons that we're taught. My initial story, I remember as a kid, there was a big fight about a soda machine in our building and in our church, and whether or not we were going to increase the price of the soda machine. And in retrospect, I had a pretty significant opinion about this, because it was a place where I could go buy a soda after church with the donut holes that we were given. And I didn't want to increase the price of that soda machine, but there was such drama around it, at least that's how I remember it as a child, that it made me realize in retrospect, there's a great deal of power in this. There's a great deal of power and control in money and how much we charge or don't charge for possessions, right? So those are just some thoughts that have gotten me started thinking, and I'm so fascinated to hear others as they tell their own stories, because often our stories are woven together in common experiences. I do have a friend who around Halloween, her children tithe 10% of the candy that they
interesting.
And they bring it and they put it in the offering plate on Sunday after Halloween. And I love that. And the kids her kids have really gotten into this, and they really enjoy doing it. And she told me last year that they decided, we're gonna give the good candy. The good candies, like the Snickers and the whatever,
Right.
the bad candy. You know what that is.
The stuff that you don't like.
Right, exactly. So that they were gonna give 10% of their good candy.
And I love that.
Right?
I love that metaphor of wanting to give the best, right? Not just give the leftovers, but to say off the top of what's valuable in my life. I want to give my best. Yeah.
So it's not just money, but it's like it's what we value, and for these kids, they value candy. So
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it almost feels like the use of what are the words that we use to talk about the resources that we have. So if we just keep talking about money, or as Maggie and Liz do so well in their book, talk about value and what you value, and offering that to the world, and aligning those things with that are important to you and important for your own sense of call in the world, and aligning that with what you're actually offering and how you're offering it through the ministries of the church. Yeah, stories I think are really important, and I think there's sometimes that stories happen that we have this vision of who we are that actually isn't matching up with reality. I have spoken to two pastors recently who are new to their churches, who just were, they're Methodists, so they were appointed to a new church. And the stories, what they're uncovering is that the stories around money in those churches actually don't match up with the reality of the money.
It happens so much.
Yeah. So that is, that can be scary if people are operating under the assumption that everything's okay, and then all of a sudden they realize, oh, actually, that's not the real story. I can imagine you've worked with churches who have this kind of thing going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Either, yes, that they're living in a time that they're no longer in. I mean, we're always often living in a time that we're no longer in, but and also thinking about what we have in terms of there can be a poverty narrative when we have a building that we have to share with our neighbors, that we have space that we provide for ministry to happen, that we have an endowment, that we actually have the power to decide what we're going to do with and how we're going to spend that, and what that means for our legacy, and how we're empowering the next generation. So there's so much more than the nickels and dimes that we put together, and to really kind of take a step back and see the big picture and do some reality checking is really important, right? I know personally how easy it is to decide that I'm in a really tight spot financially when I'm not actually. When I look at the facts, and it's like, no, you can calm down now.
Yeah.
Decisions based out of a calm place. Yeah.
What I like that you just referred to was the idea that our list of assets is actually much more than just the nickels and dimes. You mentioned the space. What space do we have to use, and how can we use? I'm so touched by the stories recently that I've heard of churches who are rethinking how they can repurpose their space, and how much more they can do with it. And it creates this sense of, oh my gosh, we have so much that we can do, even though we may be tiny now, we may be a fraction of who we were before, we still have so many different ways we have assets.
Yeah, the Spirit doesn't stop moving because we get smaller.
Yeah. So you go on to say, as you look at your budget, what does it say about your priorities as an organization? And this, again, is getting to that thing that people will be reading as well in the Money and Meaning book, and that is that aligning of that vision. And what strikes me about aligning a vision is in their book, they say you actually have to have a vision. Like it's a good idea to actually think about what are my priorities, rather than just going straight to how can we cover the budget. So I would imagine that in your work, that visioning and really asking ourselves, so what are our priorities, is a step that belongs before we even get to the nickels and dimes.
Yeah, many people have a good mission statement that they've thought through and is recent and so on and so forth, and you can take that mission statement and divide it up and put your budget on one, on the left-hand side of the paper, and the key words from your mission or vision statement on the right-hand side, and align those and see where those happen, where those things are actually happening, and you notice how many things aren't connected to that vision, perhaps. But you do have to have somewhat of a clarity around your call in order to do that kind of exercise, and that's an important exercise in its own right.
Right. So it may be that if you're sitting down as a team and you think, oh, we've got to deal with the budget, that actually you could step back a second and say, let's actually talk about our passion and where we, and the vision first before we sit down and do that thing that feels difficult or hard, or maybe it doesn't feel hard, but you just have forgotten that it doesn't just pay the bills. It actually is your ministry. It's right. And that, the gas bill and the electric bill and the bill to pay your pastor and the bill for the telephone is mission in its own right as well. Right. Right. Absolutely. You have to have electricity in order to do things. So what is that electricity allowing you to be able to do? Right. Yeah, and even as we would do this in our personal finances, to say, I'm really passionate about this thing, but I just don't, I can't contribute to that right now financially and pay the bills. So you start to get creative. Well, how can I take some of the other assets? So maybe the column the column is not necessarily a budget item that goes next to your vision, your passion, but maybe it's so many work hours or so many, people resources, or, what else can you do? So to think more holistically about all of the assets when you're sort of making the columns, we think columns are just numbers, but maybe it's also other things as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we deal with our priorities. What happens when the priorities are, or the answers to any of these questions are diverse in a group, in a team? When, we all have different ways, our personal ways of prioritizing what money does in our lives, and we bring that to if we're on a committee or a team. When we have conflict about how we believe, some people want to die with $1 million in their hands, right? So they're saving, and they bring that attitude to the church. Going to do with its money, and others are like, no, we need to just, you never know what tomorrow brings, we just need to put that money in action, right? And so we come with our different personal priorities about money, and we bring that to the group. Have you seen this, and how do we deal with differences of how we think money should be allocated or spent or saved?
Yeah, I think this is very common. We worked with a client last fall, a year ago already now, and they came to us to have us help them untangle their narrative around money. And there were people that very clearly wanted this church to stay around for 100 years and wanted the money in the bank so that it would ensure that it would stay around for 100 years. And then there were other people on the other side who were like, if we're going to go, let's go. Let's do it well. Let's go out well. Let's spend it. Let's make a difference in the world. Let's so on and so forth. And we spent a solid, 4 or 5 months working with them where they did work personally, gained some insight personally, which you have to do, and then came together as a community and did some group discernment work with each other. And they're now in a place where they're trying to figure out how to move forward, but there's so much more consciousness than there was a year ago as they started this work that it allows for a much stronger group discernment process to happen.
Oh, yeah, and I so resonate with that, because just becoming conscious and aware of that we are bringing different priorities to the table and sort of understanding why we react to each other's ideas or why we react in the ways that we do is always really, really helpful. And that's one of the things, as I sort of use it as an analogy to my field, which is not necessarily money, it's worship and helping congregations worship in more vital ways. One of the things that I always say is that when we're aware of why we resonate with different things in worship, then we can have more appreciation for the fact that other people are resonating in different ways, right? We get this appreciation, and the dialogue deepens, and the experience is much richer, and our community is much more solid because we have this awareness.
When I understand where the other person is coming from, I'm not as angry at them. I'm actually compassionate towards them. So you have to figure it out yourself as much as possible, and then listen to each other, and then it really just changes the conversation. It can't not.
Right. And that's what I'm really hoping, is that in dealing with this through worship, this subject through worship, that we can we can get a better picture of our own spiritual connection and what's going on inside of us around money, and that will then inform our meetings. So if you're a part of the finance team or whatever, that in fact you're going to have deeper conversations and more compassion for each other, and a better, richer conversation because you've done the work, and this is supporting you. So in fact, you might either be doing this worship series as you prepare for a stewardship campaign or a capital campaign, or you may be doing it as something that is leading up to, let's say, the fourth Sunday, you're going to do your usual pledge kind of thing. But every part of the process is important. And so hopefully the worship connected with this kind of focusing on the spiritual aspects in the finance team meeting, which, we don't always think when we come to the finance team meeting that we're going to engage our spiritual selves, but what I hear you saying is that in your work you think it's up. Yeah.
Yeah. I love for each meeting of the finance committee throughout the entire year, not just around a stewardship
Right.
season, there might be some prompting question that helps set the stage for how you have a conversation and over time untangle some of this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's go to these last two questions, which are really where the rubber hits the road. You're talking about, we've kind of talked about what does it feel like when you're having the conversation? What is the quality of the conversation? There's that next to the last question. But the last one is how do you do this? How do you invite your members to give? Is it passively? Is it actively? Tell us a little bit about the how-to that you help churches do.
So first you have to know historically how you've done it.
Okay.
I did some interim work in a Lutheran congregation, and I realized when I was there that the offering, there's never actually an invitation for people to give. All of a sudden, if I were from outer space, I would just see baskets going up and down aisles, and then a little song that was sung, but I would have no idea what was actually happening in that particular moment because it was never invited, never explained. Wow. So they have a more passive way, perhaps, of asking, right? So right. First we have to come to a consciousness of how we do it, but then best practices really show us that people want to be asked, that it is whether you're a person of faith or not, the act of being asked puts trust in the person and creates a partnership. And we want to be approached for in that way. And so I would encourage congregations to think about actually asking their members, that putting together a list of who the people are, whether they're members or regular participants. The idea of membership is changing so much in the church these days. And approaching each household about what they might be able to contribute for the life of this community, so that you can live into God's call on your life. And so actively asking, but not in an abusive kind of way, but more of a pastoral conversation, will get you to your budget faster, and is more effective, and helps to build trust and shift a culture of money and community. That's part of what we do, is really help walk communities through that process of asking, and then dealing with the stuff that comes up when it gets hard.
Yeah. So somebody said something really insightful to me recently, and they said it feels like people ask for money in the way that they are comfortable asking for money, or the way that they want to be asked, rather than seeing that there are many different ways to ask for money. For instance, like the most typical way that I've seen in my whole life of being in church is for somebody to go up during stewardship season and say what the church means to them.
Yep.
Right? That is like the typical way. But there's actually lots of different ways of inviting people to become partners. And perhaps learning a little bit more about how to do that would help us to see different possibilities, because I can't imagine that is motivational for everybody.
Right. And over time, after doing this for years in a row, you begin to understand how people like to be asked. Mm-hmm. So, you'll have your own separate list along with your budget and your vision and mission and all, so on and so forth, with people and how they like to be approached, and what feels most faithful to them for approach. Mm-hmm. And you have to learn that over time. For some people, it's receiving a letter and then responding. For many others, it's having a conversation, which might be uncomfortable at the beginning, but most likely proves to be fruitful, because in those conversations, you're then able to talk about what is it that makes you want to give? What is it that makes this community important to you? And where might you see some changes, and have a larger check-in conversation about the life of the community. So it's a great way of engaging in the larger health of the community. But yes, people do want to be asked in all sorts of different ways, and as a fundraiser, I think it's part of my job to help discern, help to exegete for each, for each person what their own story is and how that affects how they like to be asked and how they like to give.
Yeah. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who is dealing with this reality that their church does incredible ministry in the community, and it's very visible. And she gets so many people saying to her who are not members, right? You mentioned the idea of membership is changing. They're not members, and they really don't. Going to church is not part of their lives, but they are so not only complimentary but encouraging of the church's work in the community. They see it. And I said to this friend who's the pastor, I said, "So do you ask them for money?" And she went, like the thought of asking somebody else besides a member to support things didn't cross her mind at all. But, it seems to me that your work, both with churches and with nonprofits, why not, sort of cross-pollinate those things and say, if the church is doing something really amazing and visible in the community that's making a difference in your town, there may be people who would love to partner with you, that being part of a church is just not what they're ever going to do, but it doesn't mean that they're not a source of support for that ministry.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially to be able to ask people, they might want to give and they might want to help support, a particular angle, and perhaps not asking just to support the church in general, but a particular project or a particular passion that they have.
Exactly.
They want to be invited in too.
Yeah. And match somebody's particular passion, or something that's important to them. Maybe you're doing something about the environment. Maybe you're doing something about immigrants, whatever it is. And there are people in the community who would love to be part of that, because people are looking for a way to make a difference. And with so many people not involved in organized religion anymore, people are looking for how do we make a difference, because they want to know that their support is actually going and being used well. And so at any rate, I just wanted to bring that up because I thought it was an out-of-the-box kind of conversation. And I think this is what we have to do. We have to get creative and think out of the box and think beyond our community as well.
Yeah, if you're actually making an impact in the community, God bless it. And
right.
So there's no reason to shy away from that. Yeah.
That's right. The last thing I wanted to bring up, it's a hard thing, but I have found it very true in my 20 plus years of consulting with churches. And that is that oftentimes the big givers in the congregation historically are perceived, either it's true or it's just a perception, but it still makes the same difference, as having particular power for decision making, and especially as it relates to my field, worship, and helping people enliven their worship. Yep. I hear people say, "Oh, so and so would have a cow if we did that," right? And so they're not going to do it because if so and so has a cow, it means their money might go away. And so there's this, and I'm just bringing it up because this is reality, right? And it's something that it's also very hard to talk about.
Yep.
And so I can imagine you've encountered that as well. And that is a spiritual, that has a spiritual factor as well, because if that is actually true, then there's a sense of being held hostage in a way to particular people's preferences.
And the control there is huge.
Yeah.
The control and the power over people's spiritual life can be huge. Even more important reason to have conversations about narratives. So that, that include the entirety of the congregation.
So how do you even approach that? How do you, if you have something like that going on in a pretty major way, how do you approach that? How do you even begin that conversation? Either is that a pastoral conversation with that person? How do you do that?
Well, I think there's, there is the reality checking, going back to that we were talking about, like that person who might throw a fit might not actually throw as much of a fit as you think that they're going
Right.
to.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pastoral conversation, and taking risks, because if we're not doing that, then we're actually not really, we're not living into the vibrancy that we're called. Um, and hopefully, as if there are givers that are bigger than others that sustain the congregation, there can be some faithfulness in that giving, and trying new things. I mean, it doesn't mean that that's always the case. Also, if you lose top givers, at times you need to.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but it's, there are times that dynamic needs to shift, and it's going to be painful and it's going to be hard, but you'll live through it.
Yeah.
And it gives you opportunities actually for engaging the rest of the community
Mm-hmm.
in ways that perhaps you've been unhealthily relying on one or two families to
Right.
sustain a congregation.
Right, right. And I think Maggie and Liz do a wonderful job in their book of addressing, asking yourself, what is my motivation for giving? Am I giving so that I can control something? And so hopefully in going through this worship series and maybe doing some of the small group things, reading the book, people themselves will begin to ask those questions of themselves. What is my motivation for giving? And is it because I believe in this church, and even though not everything is to my preference or my liking, I believe in the power we have to make a difference in the world, and I want
Christian community, right? Like it's not about, we're not going to get what we want all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, Mieke, it's been wonderful to talk with you, even this little bit. I think this is going to be a wonderful way for people to sort of jumpstart conversation. Those of you who are watching, listening, there may have been something that we said that you go, oh, wow, we need to talk about that. And that is hard. And so it may be that in your conversations right now, as a follow-up to this, it may be just naming those things that are difficult, and then stepping back a little bit and saying, we don't have to get in the weeds with it right now, but let's step back, because I feel like if we get our vision more in focus, then when we do approach that difficult subject, it's going to, feel much richer and much safer. So I hope, people are going to enter into this in many different ways. I want to end with, in the worship series, we have at the beginning an affirmation. We light a candle for understanding and for illuminating those places that's hard to look at sometimes. And so I'm going to end with this. And before we sign off, Mieke, as sort of, if folks are watching this before their meeting, let this be the prayer, and you'll remember this from worship if you're in the midst of that series. But it's good to hear it again in the context of a meeting rather than just in the context of worship. And it goes like this. It says, we light this flame to affirm that where there is light, there is understanding. Where there is understanding, there is compassion. Where there is compassion, there is possibility. Where there is possibility, there is transformation. Holy and living God, transform our fears into awe-inspired wonder. Open us to this light and to the rich possibilities that it brings us for a wonderful life. So may your conversations be blessed, and thank you so much, Mieke Vandersall, for being with us.
Thank you so much.